Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Resilient Show. I'm super excited today because I have on my friend, David Barton. If you guys don't know who David Barton is, you're in for a ride. David's been not only a longtime friend of mine, but also been one of my personal advisors, mentors, someone I've looked up to forever. When I have a difficult question, as far as like working with Mighty Oaks or my own spiritual journey, David's one of the guys I called. And I'm excited to have you on, but I'm also excited for the audience to get to know you. I want to read your bio so people know exactly who you are and why this episode is going to be so important. David Barton is the founder of WallBuilders, a national pro-family organization that presents America's forgotten history and heroes, with an emphasis on our moral, religious, and constitutional heritage. David is the author of numerous best-selling books, including The Jefferson Lies and one of my favorite books, The American Story, which is amazing. And you and Tim, your son, wrote that. You are a sought-after public speaker who brings truth of America's history to churches, civic and military groups, schools and universities, and community events. You host a daily radio show, The WallBuilders Show, and have been hugely influential voice to the blaze, working with and advising our friend Glenn Beck. Because of your extensive research, you serve as a consultant to state and federal legislators, have participated in several cases at the Supreme Court, were involved in the development of the history, social studies standards for the states of Texas and California, and have helped produce history textbooks now used in schools across the nation. You have received numerous national and international awards for your research and contribution to American history. A national news organization has described you as America's historian. Times Magazine called you, and I'll quote, a hero to millions, including some powerful politicians, end quote. The Times Magazine also named you one of America's top 25 most influential evangelicals. And most importantly, you are the husband to the wonderful Miss Cheryl, who's here with us today. And you have 3 children and 5 grandchildren. Thanks for being on the show. I'm super excited to dive into this.
Thanks, man.
Before we get into the meat of the show, a lot of people love this part of the show. Some people probably get bored with it, but we have incredible sponsors that I always have to show gratitude towards. Smith & Wesson Firearms, which I know you're a fan of.
A huge fan.
Yeah. I mean, 170 years of
not just a fan, a patron.
Yep. 170 years of just legacy American, patriotic company. We have BioPro supplements, BioAccelerator stem cell therapy, which is based out of Arizona, but because of Big Pharma, they're down in Colombia doing their clinic, doing amazing work, by the way, especially for our military and first responders. They do some charitable work for them. Allied Wealth Management, and Gators Eyewear. So they all make the show possible. Some of them wanted to give you a special thanks today. I'll start off with Gators Eyewear. This is one of my pairs, but we're getting you your own pair. These are ballistic lens shooting glasses, and they pop off, and you can put all different kinds of color lenses. So you're going to get you some smoke, some clear. This pink is my favorite color. Now, pink's not my favorite color, but it's my favorite lenses to shoot with because it really relaxes your eyes. So this is
love it.
Incredible eyewear. Anybody who wants a pair of Gators,
that's great.
Go to Gators, and American made and just super high quality.
Awesome.
One of my favorite guns from Smith & Wesson.
Oh, look there.
It's the 1854 model lever action Smith & Wesson. It's a 44 Magnum, and it is an awesome brush gun. I know you love hunting hogs because I've been hunting with you before. This is it. So I'll clear it. I have a Vortex optic on it because this one's mine. You're going to get your own. This one's mine. This is a Vortex optic I have on it. But we're going to get you both this firearm and a Vortex.
Man. That is wonderful. Love Vortex, love Smith & Wesson. We support them in other ways as well. This is great.
Well, you're going to have your own. And my friend Shamus over at Vortex, amazing patriot himself, and they make, obviously, some of the best optics out there. They're making them for our U.S. military. And this razor is one of my favorite sights, and I think this would be a phenomenal to go on top of that.
Wow.
For the type of hunting you do and who you are, this would be phenomenal to go on top of that 1850.
Man, thank you.
So,
thank you. Wonderful.
The Razor HD Gen 2 Echo. It's a 1x6 by 24. So you'll kill a lot of hogs.
Christmas came early for a lot of years to come. This is great.
Yeah.
This is great.
Yeah. There you go. I'll let you have that, and we'll get with our team here and get you that rifle and these glasses out to you. So
love it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks to our sponsors. And I have so many questions. Like some of our episodes, you're asking how long this could be. It could be 30 minutes or it could be 5 hours. So I don't know. I don't have a timer set.
Well, I'm prepped for anything you want, bro. You go as long as you want to.
You brought some cool artifacts here related to military history. We're gonna get into some of that. But being the American historian, like I want everybody to know, and I still have some curiosity myself. How did you become like America's historian? Like where did that start from? It's not a career path you probably set on, right?
And kind of put it in perspective, right now we own somewhere probably over 100,000 original documents and artifacts, etc. There's 2 big museums in North Texas, world-class museums. One's over in Las Colinas called the American Journey Experience. One's in Alito, WallBuilders.
That's yours. WallBuilders is yours.
WallBuilders is ours. And so you mentioned Glenn Beck. And so one of the things, I help run Glenn's nonprofit organizations. So that's where you and I have been connected in so many things in Afghanistan and rescue and recovery and so many things that happen. And so Glenn also has a huge collection of artifacts, memorabilia. And so I help run that for him, help do the training on history over there.
What's that place called?
It's called the American Journey Experience.
Okay.
Mercury One is the nonprofit, and the American Journey Experience is the museum side of it. And so, among other things, we just got, if you're into space history, we just got the Mercury 7 space capsule from NASA. There were 2 done. There was the one that went into space, and then there was a replica that they kept. So we just got the replica. And so we've got everything. We got George Washington's eyeglasses. We've got so many things from Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, Lincoln's collar with blood on it.
All the blood-stained collar. So it's an awesome museum to go through. So we collect history like that. Over in the Alito Museum is a lot more of the documents and the books. The North Dallas Museum is a lot of the bigger artifacts, the big things. We got cars. We got a lot of George Patton stuff there. We've got a lot of large stuff.
So one of the things you have, though, you talked about the Apollo missions. You have the Bible.
Yeah.
Can you explain that? Because I've been to both these museums, by the way, for those listening, and you have to go.
It's just kind of a background on the Apollo program itself, because the way we've grown up in history in America, and this is kind of what got me started in history. So I'm going to back up and answer that question, then come back to the Apollo question.
Yeah.
Is I hated history. I was a math and science guy in school. I grew up hating history because I got white hair. That's from a generation or 2 ahead of you.
Yeah.
So take me back into 6th grade. And in 6th grade, which that's got to be back in the 50s, 60s, whatever it is. So 6th grade, my history teacher in 6th grade, I remember very explicitly told me that George Washington had 26 illegitimate children, giving new meaning to the phrase Washington slept here. And I thought, that's the national hero? I'm not interested. And so I got turned off history and didn't like anything about American founding, et cetera. So I went through school being a math and science guy. I got a scholarship to college, math and science, and did that in high school, did a lot of math and science stuff. When I was done with college, I became principal of a school, taught math and science, coached basketball, but a school principal. And I got into a situation where I stumbled across some really old, original historical documents. And they dealt with George Washington. And they're exactly the opposite of what my teacher told me. So I'm going, whoa. I'm seeing the originals, but here's what I was taught. I wonder if anything else I was taught wrong. And so when we started looking for originals, the whole story completely turned around. And one of the things that I learned about Washington was, no, he was not immoral. He was very moral. He was very religious. He has a great speech. His final speech is, America cannot survive if religion and morality is not the basis of the nation. That's the only way you get what he called political prosperity. I've got one of his documents there we can look at later where he talks about how important religion is to the nation. You can't survive. So I've been taught that he's a irreligious, and immoral guy, and that's just not true. So going back to that, what's happened in the last several decades, America has lost any kind of knowledge of who our heroes are and really the truth about them, and particularly religion and morality related to them. So let's go back to the question with Apollo. So you get back, and the space stuff all goes back to 57. The Russians got guys a satellite in space before we did, Sputnik. And with the Cold War and Eisenhower, we're concerned that, man, they're going to use that as a platform for weapons. They'll attack us. So we got to get in space too so that we can balance this thing out. So we get into the space program in the late 50s. And so as we move into the space program, then the Soviets get somebody up in space, and they have their first astronauts. And so we got to do that too. And so that's where you start with the Mercury program. The Mercury program was, can we get someone in space? Can we, and it wasn't long. I mean, you go up and maybe make an orbit around the Earth, or maybe 2 or 3 hours, and come back and splash down in the ocean. And we did it first with animals to see if it could be done, and then we were able to move to people. And so we're trying to keep up the Russians so they don't get an edge on us with technology and with military stuff.
This was known as a space race, right?
Oh, this is where space race came from. And it was all about, if they get a nuclear platform in space, they will use it. We're not going to. We'll use it as a deterrent. They will use it as an offensive weapon. We'll use it as a defensive weapon. And so the first part of the space program is the Mercury program, and that's one person in the capsule. Then we get into a two-person program. Let's get two people in space and stay a little longer, stay a couple days. And that's the Gemini program. So Gemini is two people. And then you had President Kennedy, who went to Houston, and at Rice University, he said, hey, let's put a man on the moon by the end of this decade. And NASA's going, what? You didn't tell us about that. And so now they've got this challenge. They've got just a few years to be able to figure out how to get a man on the moon. And so the Russians were trying to do that too, but they didn't get done, but we did.
So I just want to clarify, you said we did. I know there's a lot of debate if it actually happened.
Oh, yeah, and let's come back to that, because
I'm super curious.
There's some great stuff even today that can easily answer whether anybody's been on the moon. I'll give you one right now. Lasers, one of the guys who walked on the moon was Charlie Duke, a good friend of mine, really good friend, lives here in Texas. He became a Christian after he got back from space. He was in Apollo 16. He's the youngest man ever to walk on the moon. And then Jim Irwin is Apollo 15. And there's a bunch of guys that went to space and had a real spiritual experience when they got back. It's like, I've never seen anything like this. This is impossible to exist. And they can't even explain how awesome it was. But what they did was they left all sorts of communication devices on the moon. Actually, in my family, my grandfather, farmer rancher in hill country down in Georgetown area, but he was also a brilliant scientist. He actually developed the gravity meter that they took to the moon and left on the moon. And for 7 years, as long as the battery lasted, it broadcast back the gravity readings on the moon, because we knew it was about 1/6 gravity of what Earth was. And so he actually developed the stuff that they took to the moon, left there until the battery ran out. It was broadcasting back. So there's all this stuff left on the moon. Some of the things they left on the moon were laser reflectors. And so there are laser reflectors that are put on the moon in various positions, and they could beam signals off it. But to this day, you can take a laser beam and point it at the moon, and it will bounce back if you know where those beams are. So how did they get there if nobody went to the moon? How did you get laser plates there that reflect back to this day that you can read back? So there's a lot of evidence, and it became a big thing that no, they really didn't land on the moon. That was all made up. That was all in studios, et cetera. But we have a lot of stuff that actually went to the moon. So in the third part of the space program, you get into the Apollo. And the Apollo program is where you have 3 men in the capsule, because one guy's got to keep moving around the moon, and the other 2 are going to come down and land, and they got to come back. So we went from 1 man to 2 men to 3 men. And so when you get in Apollo 1, Ed White was one of the first astronauts in Apollo 1, and Apollo 1 had an accident on the pad, and there was a fire. It burned all 3 astronauts, killed all 3.
Right.
And so what happened at that point was a bunch of the Apollo staff, people working on the Apollo program, said, this really is a dangerous thing. We need to be praying for these guys. And so they started what's called the Apollo Prayer League. And the Apollo Prayer League, what they did is they prayed for every mission, every practice, everything going on. They just got dedicated to prayer. And so as it goes, every mission that goes up in Apollo, and Apollo 1 through Apollo 8, 1 through 7 is we're not going to the moon. We're just going up and spending some time and space around Earth and see how it works with 3 and what do we need to change. And so then starting with Apollo 8, we're going to the moon, but we're not landing. So Apollo 8 is the first to go to the moon. So what happens is they're praying for all these missions as they go. And Apollo 8, as they go to the moon, Frank Borman, Anders died just a few weeks ago. He was on that mission. It happened that they were orbiting the moon when Christmas happened, and Christmas Eve, December 24 to 25. And so they gave a Christmas message back to Earth. And the Christmas message they gave back to Earth, the 3 astronauts just read the first part of Genesis out of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And they went through and read those first 10 verses. And so what happened was, at that time, a very famous atheist named Madalyn Murray O'Hair heard that NASA, they read the Bible in space to all, that's unconstitutional, separation of church and state. And so she filed a lawsuit against NASA. So that lawsuit is against NASA. But what had happened was you had some faith guys and guys not hostile to faith, and they read about creation. And so what happens is you get on toward Apollo 11, and that's where you're landing on the moon. That's where Neil Armstrong gets out. That's where Buzz Aldrin gets out. And so as you get to that point on Apollo 11, you can listen to the tapes of NASA, and you can hear them touch down and checking the gauges and checking the readings and everything's right and how much fuel and do we have enough to take off. And then it just goes silent for 8, 10, 15 minutes. It just goes quiet. What's that all about? What's all about is when they got to the moon, Buzz Aldrin said, this is a huge, momentous event. I don't want to do this without dedicating this to the Lord. I mean, this is a great achievement. And so he had communion before he got off the space capsule. And what he did was church back in Houston had communion at the same time. So he's sitting on the moon. They had the time agreed, and they all take communion together. And when he got back, he actually made a replica of that communion cup and signed it. And so we have that at the museum, that replica communion cup from Buzz Aldrin. So Neil Armstrong gets off, Buzz Aldrin gets off. But NASA knew it was going to happen. They said, hey, let's not broadcast it because we'll get another lawsuit. She'll sue us again if we do anything religious. And so then you go to Apollo 11, 12, and Apollo 13. That's where they had the accident in space and the movie Apollo 13. They didn't land, and they shouldn't have got back home, but miraculously they did. But they had 100 Bibles on Apollo 13 that they were going to take to the moon. And they were going to build an altar on the moon and leave one of those Bibles on the altar. So they didn't make it on Apollo 13, so they moved it to Apollo 14. And so Apollo 14 goes to the moon, and of Apollo 14, they have 100 Bibles that were in the space capsule, and they were microform Bibles. Each Bible was about the size of a postage stamp because it was kind of like microfilm, but microform is what they called it then. And so the whole Bible is there, but it's just tiny. It's magnifying glass, you can read it. Or actually a microscope, not magnifying glass. It's microscope, you could read it. So they built an altar there. They left one of those Bibles on the moon with Apollo 14 and then brought the others back. And so we now own 3 of those Bibles that went to the moon. So those Bibles came back as part of the museum, you can see. And then you have people, Apollo 15, Jim Irwin, I mean, just a real spiritual experience for him. And then Charlie Duke with Apollo 16, and he's a great guest to have. He's still alive, and he's a sharp guy.
We'll have to set that up.
Yeah, you'll have to set Charlie Duke up. You'd love hearing the moon stuff and ask him all those hard questions because he's been through all of it, and he can tell you all the details scientifically. So that's kind of the backstory of that. We have that Mercury 7 space capsule now from NASA. But there's so many things from NASA that are so fun. We have a lot of the food that they carried in space with them, and all packaged, and it's like a ham sandwich, and it looks like a bunch of powder, and they were able to re-moisturize it, and they would turn it into a sandwich. It's awesome stuff that they did technologically back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, so it's great.
Yeah, now we can't give a cell phone that works.
That's right. That's right.
I can't get mine to work.
Well, it's interesting. Cell phone. Charlie with Apollo 16 he held up a cell phone. He said, "You see that?" He said, "There's more technology in your cell phone than we had in 2 full rooms of computers when we came on Apollo." He said, "You got more stuff right here." And I thought that's because the size of the computers back then, all the air conditioning they had to have for it. That's a good point, man. We've come a long way technologically, and we just kind of assume, where we are. But man, when you're back at that point in time, it was a dangerous thing what they did.
They pulled it off, yeah. I just interviewed Sebastian Gorka. The episode hadn't come out yet. Maybe it'll come out. Maybe it's been out since when this one airs. But he's got a project he's working on, kind of a it's almost like a MythBusters, like conspiracy theories, and either validating or debunking them. And he's affirmed that from his research, the moon landing was real. Mm-hmm. I think I've heard a lot of people say that a lot of the stuff that they're like pictures and the AI saying, these pictures were not taken on the moon. I think maybe some of that, this is my personal opinion, maybe some of that was produced to be able to show to the American public. So maybe there was some of that, but I personally believe the moon landing.
Charlie's convinced it happened. He's got he has had enough critics for enough years that he can pretty easily prove it.
Yeah. Yeah, people don't get to keep secrets that good.
Yeah, that's right.
So all that leads you to, well, I guess we kind of get to you becoming an American historian and doing what you do
now.
Yeah,
so once I found out that what I was taught about history was false, then I started looking for more originals. And there were lots of originals around because it's an interesting thing, just education today. A lot of states give merit pay for teachers based on how well the students do. So if your students do really well, you get more money. And one of the ways that you can make sure your students do well is you make sure and teach what's on the test. And that's not a problem because what's on the test is what you're supposed to know. So teachers will teach to the test. Well, it's interesting. History is the only primary subject in education that has no exit exam. There's no test at the end of the course. There's not anything like like you would have on achievement tests. You take the SAT test or whatever. You're going to do STEMs. You're going to do the science and the math, and you're going to do the reading, but there's nothing on history. So there's nothing that pushes teachers to teach history. And so what we find is it's probably the least known, least emphasized course in schools. It has no testing on it. No end of course test mandated by the state. The state mandates that you do the STEM stuff and the reading stuff, et cetera, but there's nothing on history. And so it has fallen by the way.
I think I heard you say, though, and sorry to interrupt you, but I think I heard you say before that in America you get a master's degree in history and never have taken American history.
That's right. Yeah. This was 10 years ago. The American College of Trustees and Alumni went through and looked at history majors. And what they do every year, there's thousands of colleges, and they will pick a topic and say, how are colleges dealing with this topic, whatever it is. And so one year, about 10 years ago, they chose how are colleges dealing with history. And if you got 81%, and you have what's called the elite colleges. So every year, U.S. News and World Report comes out with their list of the top colleges in America. And so out of thousands of colleges, there's going to be 80, 100 colleges on that list. And so they took that elite list and said, all right, these are the elite colleges, these are the best colleges in America this year. What are they doing with history majors? And they went to those schools, and I think it was 81% a history major could get a major in history without taking a single course in American history. You could take every other kind of history there was, but there's no requirement for American history. And that used to be a requirement for every college kid. You used to have 2 years of college history. Every kid did. You had pre-1865 and post-1865. So when I went to college, everybody got 2 years to college. You had the core elements, and you also had that in high school. That's not a requirement in high school anymore, and it's definitely not a requirement in college. And so you have a lot of history teachers now who have a history degree, but they've never had an American history course. And so they know very little about it. And that's where we collect items. This is where we've got 100,000 items more. About anything that goes on, we've got what everybody says, but we've also got the originals. And that's what got me going, was when I started finding originals. And I went to school at a time when we still did teach history. We just didn't teach it well.
Yeah.
So I get these originals. I go, that's not what I was. Oh, great example. The separation of church and state. You don't have religion in school. And I found an 1844 U.S. Supreme Court case that was a unanimous decision where the U.S. Supreme Court said, hey, if you're going to be a government-funded school, you are going to teach the Bible in schools. We're not going to have a government-funded school that won't teach the Bible. Whoa. A unanimous 8-0 Supreme, and I'm holding the Supreme Court decision in my hand, 1844, and they're talking about, of course, Justice Wilson. I said, who in the heck is Justice Wilson? And I looked him up. He's a signer of the Constitution. He's called a father of the Constitution. He's the second most active member in it. And it turned out that he had 3 volumes. He started the first law school in America, or maybe the second, debate on what's first or second. But while he's sitting on the Supreme Court, he's teaching a law school, and he has 3 volumes. Well, we found those original 3 volumes. We now own those 3 volumes. And so I'd never heard of Justice, but the guy who upright the Constitution, I'd never heard his name before. I should have heard that. And then in his writings, he's talking about, Judge Hopkinson. I'm going, who's Judge Hopkinson? Well, he's a signer of the Declaration of Independence. George Washington made him one of the first federal judges, and so he's a significant founding father. I've never heard his name before, and so I get his writings, and we now actually have some of his writings that were out of his own library. I mean, so we've got all these original things from guys that originally did it, and you read that, and you read what we're saying today, and that's no. Politics has gotten involved in this. We're not getting truth in history. We're getting a political view of history that somebody wants us to think, like the separation of church and state stuff. That existed, but that only meant that the government can't make you all Baptists or Catholics. It doesn't mean we're a God-free environment. And so that's what's so different is when you go back and see the originals, when you go back and look at that, it's a whole different story. It's a great story of America, a terrific story.
So, I mean, you're not talking about just removing American history. You're talking about altering American history to the next generations.
Well, it's 1619 Project is a great example of altering American history. Now, I get asked, you read the bio, and so I'm asked in a bunch of states to help write their history and government standards. And so when I look at standards like California or Texas or Ohio or Utah or wherever it is, the first thing I look for is not what's in the standards, but what's not in the standards. In other words, what did they drop out? And so here's a great example. The AP U.S. History course, a U.S. History, APUSH is what it's called, but any AP course, these are courses that you give to kids in high school that are really good in that subject, so they're getting college credit while they're in high school. So you have there were about 47 AP courses where you can get college credit in high school. Now there's a lot more. They've created some in the last 10 years. But nonetheless, that AP course, when you looked at the AP U.S. History, and this was back, David Coleman took over the AP board. They came out with new history standards. So when he did this in 2014, I'm looking at it, and as you're going through, and these are the top kids in American history. They didn't mention founding fathers. There was no mention of Jefferson or Adams. None of that stuff was there. They didn't mention any battle in the American Revolution. There was nothing about America becoming a nation. They did not mention the Civil War. They did not mention any battle in the Civil War. They did not mention any leader in the Civil War. There was nothing about either Lee or Grant, either side. You got into Lincoln. There was no Lincoln-Douglas debates. There was no Emancipation Proclamation. There was none of that with Lincoln. He's all gone. And you keep moving forward, and the wars are gone. I got to World War II. World War II, there was no mention of the Germans or of the Japanese in World War II. There was no mention at all of the Holocaust. There was no mention of Hitler. There was no mention of the Nazis. There was no mention of any battle. There wasn't the Battle of the Bulge. There wasn't D-Day. D-Day's. I'm just going, this is all gone. Now, here's what's important. If I were to step in front of a group and said, did you guys know that America dropped a nuclear weapon on Taiwan to end World War XVII? And everybody would laugh at me because everybody knows we haven't had a World War XVII. Taiwan would, but that's only because we know who they are. If we stop teaching about anything, and I made a claim like that, you go, wow, I've never heard that before. And that's where we are with American history now. We can make all sorts of claims about American history because we don't know what actually happened. So when I see something disappear, that tells me in about 30 years from now, here's what we're going to be teaching, and it's going to be totally opposite. So you take stuff out so you can change the direction. So now we got the 1619 project that comes out that talks about how that America is founded with racism. Jamestown is the proof of the racism of America. The 1619 is when slaves came ashore in Jamestown, and this is where slavery got started in America, and that defined America. Okay, so just a few facts along the way. There were some slaves that came ashore in Jamestown in 1619. That's true. The rest of the story is when they came ashore, Jamestown said, we don't permit slavery in Jamestown. It's illegal here. So those slaves that came ashore in Jamestown were all made free. They all became free landowners. Now, what happened was one of those free landowners, a black man named Anthony Johnson, he started sponsoring people to come to America, what they call indentures. I'll loan you $10,000. You can get to Europe over here, but you're going to have to work for me 7 years to pay back this $10,000. So it's an indenture. So he indentured a man. So this is Anthony Johnson, and he indentures a black man named John Kaser. Well, after the 7 years ran out, he said, this laziest guy I've ever had. I haven't got my money back. So he went to court and said, hey, and this is the court of Virginia. He said, can I own this guy for the rest of his life? Because it's going to take the rest of his life for him to pay off what he owes me. And they said, yeah, you can. So the first occasion of lifetime slavery in America is when a black man sues to own another black man. Anthony Johnson in 1653 sued to own John Kaser, and the court said yes. So that's not the story of the 1619 project, but who knows the real story of what happened? And by the way, the court cases are there. You can read that in Virginia history, but nobody covers that anymore. So then you have, okay, so this is the racism of America. And then you find out, well, there's another colony that started in 1620, and from the very first, they banned slavery. And that's the Plymouth colony. It's not Jamestown, it's Plymouth. And when a slave ship arrived there in 1646, they actually imprisoned the captain and all the officers because slavery is illegal there, and slavery's never been legal in Massachusetts, ever, at any point in time. And so you're saying the whole nation's built around Jamestown, and you didn't even get the Jamestown story right. You definitely didn't get the Massachusetts story right. And what you'll find is in 1641, there was a guy named Matthias de Souza, and Matthias de Souza was a black man, and he lived in Maryland. 1641, he is elected by a white community to be in the state legislature in Maryland. So we've elected a black man to the state legislature in a white community in Maryland in 1641. That's cool. Jump ahead to something like 1768. There's a guy named Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell is a black man in a white community, and he got elected to office. And he got reelected for the next 49 years. He held 8 different political positions. He starts a public school system in New Hampshire. He starts a library system in New Hampshire. He's a black man elected to office. He made a Paul Revere ride. He's part of the revolution. He went warning all the people in his community the British are coming. And then let's just jump into the Civil War time. By the time you get to 1876, there have been 1,000 black elected officials in America by 1876. When did Great Britain elect their first black official to office? 1987. Wait a minute. We've had 1,000 by 1876, and we're the racist nation of the world? When did Italy elect its first black official to office? 2010. And we did it back in 1641? See, when you don't know your history, you can be told, and now we all feel guilty about who we are. And yeah, we made mistakes, absolutely, because humans make mistakes. There's not a nation in the world that didn't have slavery at the American founding, not a nation. We're the first nation in the world where all the northern states got rid of slavery. Nobody did it before the northern states. Nobody signed a ban on importation of slaves before Thomas Jefferson did in March the 1st of 1807. It became a federal law January the 1st, 1808. No nation did that before we did.
You really break that down in your book, Jefferson Lies.
Yeah, Jefferson Lies.
And they attacked that book, by the way.
They attacked that book. And well,
they tried to get you off the New York Times bestseller list. And
well, a bunch of non-history professors attacked that book because they didn't like the conclusion it came to. But the cool thing is I document everything. They talk about how that their books are heavily documented, 200 footnotes. I had 1,500 footnotes, and they all go back to original documents. They don't go back to some professor's book. They go back to the originals, and I can show you the and so, the book did really well. It was a bestseller and did real well. And some professors got the attention of the media and criticized it, and that's fine. They weren't history professors anyway, so but the media's looking for controversy, and they got it. But that's why history is so important to tell the truth, because it affects the way we think in the future. And if America knew today what had actually happened with black and white history in America, just throw another piece of trivia out. There's a black man who's called the father of black history in America. He's responsible for Black History Month. Carter Woodson, great guy. And in 1930, Carter Woodson said, we have all these American records. I'm going to go back and look at the census of 1830, 100 years ago. So he's in 1930, so I'm going to look at 1830. And 1830, all the census listed how many slaves there were, how many in every state, slave owners, etc. And that's still public record today. So he went back and he found that in 1830, free blacks in South Carolina, 43% of free blacks owned black slaves in South Carolina. 39% of free blacks owned black slaves in Georgia and Louisiana. And it's like, man, that's really high. So black on black slavery was a thing? Yeah, it was a huge thing. 43%, 39%. Nobody talks about that. And then, as it turns out, when slavery was abolished in the 13th Amendment, 1865, it didn't end it in the Indian tribes because they're considered separate nations. And so the Constitution treats them separately. So the federal government had to negotiate treaties to end slavery in the Indian tribes, and that was in 1868 and 1870, et cetera.
In the African slave trade, Africans are enslaving other Africans,
Yep.
and they're selling them around the world.
That's right.
What percentage of those came to America?
Well, that's a good question, because what happens is if you go from 1501 to 1875, you will find that in that 374 years, about 12.7 million Africans were involuntarily exported out of Africa. And out of all that group coming, 12.7 million, 300,000 came to America over the course of 375 years. And that percent is around 3%.
So we take the 100% of the heat.
Oh, we hear professors on a regular basis say all of those slaves came to America. 12.7 million came to America.
But only 3% came here. So where'd the rest go?
That's right. And so 46% of them went into Brazil and Portugal. 26% went into Great Britain, 26% into Spain, 14%, I forget the numbers, but they're all high, and America's down at 0.3%. So we got, 0.3%, and here's all these guys at 46%, and we're getting the blame for all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And by the way, just to point it out, I mentioned 374 years, there's 12.7 million slaves. Today in America and today in the world, there are 40 million active slaves today in the world. We have 3 times as many active slaves in the world today as we had in 375 years of history. How come nobody's talking about what's happening today? 193 nations at the UN this year, 94 nations still have not abolished slavery. It's still legal.
And America has.
And America has.
America's the racist.
We're one of the, and we're the racist nation?
Yeah, I mean, just seems like common logic would say, let's not look at something 400 years ago, which, it's important to look at history. Obviously, I'm talking to you. But can we not look at what's happening now? And if we care about slavery, can we address slavery right now?
One of the things that you dealt with, that we've dealt with over at Mercury One and our fund is, we rescued a bunch of people out of Afghanistan. And that's an area that still does have slavery.
Which we have 20 million women and little girls that are sexually enslaved right now in Afghanistan.
That's right.
And we're funding it, by the way, by sending $87 million a week.
The stuff. That's right.
Yeah.
And so it's still active and going on. If anybody wants to know, it just doesn't make the news. Nobody.
Well, if you really want to attack America on that. The United States government is funding $87 million a week to the Taliban, who are sexually enslaving women and little girls as young as 9 years old. So.
You've worked with us on the Nazarene Fund before. Nazarene Fund exists to help persecuted Christians and religious minorities. Yes. So in Islamic lens, that's going to be Christians, it's going to be Yazidis in the Middle East and other religious minorities. And we are rescuing on a regular basis sex slaves out of those nations to this day. Right now, we have active operations going on. And that's slavery today. Everybody thought it was over and done with, and only America had slaves. I don't know.
Yeah, if BLM wants to take that mantle up, I'll join. Yeah. I'll join that one. Yeah. I mean,
that's right.
Because I guess most grotesque thing in the world is to own another human being.
That's right.
Especially for sexual slavery.
That's right.
Not that any slavery is good, but especially sexual slavery. And
that's right.
If we really want to fight for that press, then that's what we should be fighting for.
This is fighting sexual slavery in several Far East nations. It has turned out the easiest way to free sex slaves is to buy them. And you can buy them for $60. And so you can buy a sex slave for $60 and bring them to another country, get them set up, get them, that life turned around. This is such a regular part of life in so many countries that it's a commodity for $60. I mean, I have a car wash I just got in my truck that was $60 on a car wash. So a car wash inside, outside my truck, I could have bought a slave and freed a slave for that amount. It just doesn't cross Americans' minds that way, but it's so common in the world.
I was saving this topic for later, but since we're here, the attack on our education, the removing of those things you spoke about, the intentionally putting false history into our education system, I say intentional, and that's actually my question. Is it just like historical disagreement, or is it intentional? And if it is intentional, who's behind it?
It was intentional at one time. It is now ignorant this time. I'm just teaching what I was taught in school. And so it happens to be wrong because when you look at the originals, it's wrong. I built houses and construction for a long time. And what you do is you create a pattern for something. If I have a pattern for the joists or the rafters that I want, I'll use one pattern only, and that's it. If I make a pattern and use the pattern that I made and use the pattern that I made, it gets off. The more times you use it, the further off it is. What's happened is we had some intentional people that taught history wrong in the 1980s particularly. Howard Zinn was a great example. Taught it wrong, but there's a whole lot of people went through university using his textbooks, and they didn't know it was wrong, so they were taught what they were taught, and now more people have taught. And so what you get is you now have you're several degrees away from the original stuff, and now you got a lot of people teaching it wrong, but it's ignorance. They're not being deliberate. They're not trying to destroy America. They just don't know what the truth is. They don't know what to say to the 1619 Project. They've never gone back to look at the actual laws of Virginia to see if 1619 Project was true. They don't know. And so we're at a place now where I'll be careful how I say it. I don't want to say laziness.
That was the word I was going to say. It's laziness, right?
Yeah. I'm not going to say every teacher that teaches wrong is lazy, but they haven't spent time going back to the original documents. And that's why it's so important to go back to the original, not the hearsay. You don't play that telephone tree game, the hearsay stuff. You have to go back to the originals. Progressives in the 20s through the 60s, then the 60s through the 80s is where it really manifested itself with hostility. And now we're living out the fruits of the 80s and Howard Zinn and those kind of professors. There's a great book. It's called The Godless Constitution. It's done by two professors at Cornell University, and it looks at the Constitution. Now, I think one's an English professor and one's a literature professor. So they're not Constitution guys. They're not even history guys. But they go through and they prove the Constitution is absolutely godless. And at the end, you look at footnotes, and it says a note on sources. And they said, we have dispensed with the usual scholarly apparatus of footnotes. There's not a single footnote in their entire book. And that book, written in 1996, is still a textbook in universities today, A Godless Constitution. There's not a single footnote in it. They're just all repeating each other. It's circle talk.
Right, and they're referencing each other.
They're referencing each other, and they don't even do that in a footnote. They just say everybody knows this is true. We're just telling you it's true.
Yeah.
Well, put a footnote to it if it's true, and that's just not what happens anymore.
I do a lot of public speaking, like you do, and oftentimes I speak in churches.
Yeah.
I feel, full confession, I feel so unqualified every time I step on a pulpit. I'm like, what am I doing here? I'm just pray to God will use my mouth to speak His word, but when I step on that pulpit, I feel like this overwhelming responsibility to get it right. And so when I quote scripture, my conscious will not let me just quote a scripture. I want to know who said it, where they said it, what was the context. I spend a lot of time before I open my mouth on a pulpit to speak God's word, and because my words will have impact on people's lives.
Right.
And
you're responsible.
And as a history teacher, or someone who is an author, it's so easy to be able to have these platforms to do that. It's easy for me to get up on a pulpit, but that responsibility should bring some obligation to make sure what I'm saying is accurate.
Well, there's so many that don't know, and one of the things that we do in the summer at WallBuilders is with all this collection, we do teacher training in the summer. So anybody that's teaching history from kindergarten up through university president, they come in the summers, and we will go through history, but we'll also go through all the original documents.
They're getting sources.
That's sources. So don't believe us. And we tell them, don't believe us. Challenge us on anything and everything. If you think we're wrong, challenge us, and let's go look at the originals and see what it says.
The college professor of today, most of them would never say challenges.
Oh, they would never say that. But we teach them how to say that, and we teach them what the history is, and they come away being blown away because that's not what I was taught. That's not what my history teacher taught me. That's not what my history degree said. And so going back to if anybody wants to be trained in history, go to the website, wallbuilders.com, get your history teacher signed up in the summer, but we do these things in the summer, and we'll do an hour on the Civil War, then we'll go look at Civil War documents. We'll do an hour on whatever it is, and then go look at the documents. If we can get that going again, if those teachers will teach kids what actually happened, we'll be a whole different nation. One
of the things you mentioned was that these professors or authors wrote this kind of case that the Declaration of Independence is godless, that it only articulates government structure. Some of the quotes was that the Declaration only references God 4 times. That's kind of one of the things I've heard. But I think they miss a couple of things. One, they miss that 55 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence was all Christians. The second is that it's a collection of the 13 states and colonies, and so you have to go look back at those constitutions for those states, right? And those states all had a statement of faith that referenced Jesus as Lord.
And it was very, very common, but there's also some more to it than that. Take the 56 signers of the Declaration, 27 of them had seminary degrees. You're going to tell me that a bunch of seminarians wrote a godless document. That doesn't make sense. And just a great example is University of Houston said, and just so we understand how blessed we are, okay, there's 5,800 years of recorded human history. There's thousands of nations. There's hundreds of constitutions, and Cornell University Law School said, with all of the written history, what's the average length of a constitution in the history of the world? Which is a great question. Average length of a constitution is 17 years. Now, America, we've just hit 237 years. We'll hit 238 just in a few weeks. So we're the world's record. Nobody's ever been that close. Nobody has never been close to where we are. We're so far ahead of what's second place. I mean, there's nobody within seeing distance of what we've done. So we criticize America. We're so used to stability, we just think it's natural. No. 17 years is natural. 238 is not natural. So universities...
I want to clarify that number because we've been a nation for 249 years.
Yeah, and that's the Declaration.
That's the Declaration.
So the 11 years difference between the Declaration and the Constitution. So the Constitution is 11 years less than independence.
Okay.
And so what happens with going back and looking at it, University of Houston said, okay, so evidently our founding fathers came up with ideas that other people didn't use because ideas work wherever you use them. Gravity is going to be the same in every nation. And if you use the laws of gravity, you're going to get the same result. So the founding fathers apparently came up with some ideas that nobody else had been using. Where'd they get them? So what the University of Houston did, they said, we're going to go back to the time when they wrote the documents, and we're going to look at their writings, and they took 15,000 writings from the founding era. They said, we're going to go through those writings, and we're going to see if we can find who they quoted. Because if I followed you around all day and listened to who you quoted, I'd know who you think's important. So in the 15,000 writings, they found 3,154 direct quotes. They said, okay, now we're going to find the source of all those quotes. And they looked to see who the founders quoted and went back to it. And so what they found was the number one most cited individual at the time when they created all of our documents was a guy named Baron Charles Montesquieu. He wrote a 2-volume set called The Spirit of the Laws, talked about separation powers, good stuff. The number 2 most cited individual was Judge William Blackstone. He wrote a 4-volume set that we used to help establish our courts, great legal books. The number 3 most cited individual was John Locke, the 2 treatises of government. We used that especially when we wrote the Declaration. Richard Henry Lee, who's the guy in Congress who said, hey, let's separate from Great Britain, he's responsible for the Declaration. He said, we copied the Declaration from John Locke's 2 treatises of government. So those are your 3 most cited sources. One, Montesquieu is 8.2% of all the quotes came from him. Blackstone, 7.9% of all quotes came from him. And Locke was 2.9%. What they found was that the most cited source in the time when they wrote our documents was the Bible. 34% of all quotes came out of the Bible. Now, it's interesting because we don't see the Bible in the Constitution today. Ben Franklin, there's a great letter from Ben Franklin to a preacher named Samuel Cooper. And Franklin, nobody disputes he's the least religious founding father. And yet, if you'll look at Franklin's speech on the Constitutional Convention when it was falling apart, he gave a speech Thursday, June the 27th, 1887, and he quoted 14 Bible verses in 14 sentences. He just quoted them by memory. So he's your least religious founding father, and he's quoting Bible verses like that. So when you get over and look at the Constitution itself, you'll find a clause in there that is very explicit on what the penalty is for treason. And you go, well, that's interesting. No other Constitution had that, but you'll find that exact language verbatim out of Leviticus 17:15, came out of the Bible. There's so many parts of the Constitution that are exact quotes of the Bible. But Franklin told the preacher, he said, hey, when I go to Europe, I have to tell people when I quote the Bible. He said, in America, everybody studies the Bible. I don't have to tell anybody when I quote it. So the fact that the Constitution doesn't cite the Bible, a lot of these guys think it's secular. If you read the content and compare it to Bible verses, you'll find that's an exact quote. And the founders knew that, and now University of Houston has proven that. So the secular notion stuff, it just doesn't hold
If the Constitution is set up to create for common law is a biblical process, right? You have,
that's right.
It gives presumption of innocence, due process, and a jury of your peers. From common law, which is all biblical out of Leviticus 19.
Here's a fun thing. I've been involved in 13 cases of the U.S. Supreme Court. So I was reading a case a few years ago, and Stephen Breyer was the justice who had written the opinion. And so Breyer, I would say, personal opinion, I think he is the most secular justice in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court. There's no indication of faith, of God, of anything. Right. So I'm reading along, and he says, well, of course, we all know that the due process rights came from the Bible. Well, oh, really? Do we all know that? And so I'll look at his footnote. Now, the due process clauses, that's the Constitution, that's Article 4, that's Amendment 4 through Amendment 8. The right to confront your accuser, the right to compel witnesses in your behalf, the right to testify in your own defense. All that stuff that's due process rights, 4th through the 8th Amendment of the Bill of Rights. And so I went and looked up in Federal Practice and Procedures what he cited to, and that's the federal law books whereby you practice federal law. Volume 30 had 20 pages on how the Bible produced specific Bill of Rights. For example, that federal law book says, well, the right to confront your accuser comes out of John chapter 8, verse 10. And then you'll find the right to compel witnesses in your behalf. That's Proverbs 18:17. And then you'll find that the right to speak in your own defense, Acts 22:1. These are all Bible verses. So the fact that we don't know where they come from today, we just assume it's all secular. But they used to know where that stuff came from. They were much more, I'm going to say educated. They were much more widely educated than we were. They knew the Bible. Everybody in school, when I went to school as a kid, we all read the Bible in schools until the Supreme Court took it out in 1963. So as a nation, we were biblically literate. We didn't have those questions. Those questions have all come up since 63, since we're no longer biblically literate. But even Franklin was biblically literate.
John Adams said that the Constitution was only written said only written for moral and religious people. And so if our Constitution was written for a Christian society based on, all this evidence, right? Then it's not surprising that a nation that has turned their backs on God would be incompatible
That's right.
with a government that was structured as
and the fact it's written only for moral, because if you can't control yourself by the Ten Commandments, there's not enough power in the DOJ to keep you under control.
Right.
If you can't keep yourself from lying and cheating and murdering and everything else, the Constitution doesn't address moral issues because we had a moral people that was based on the Bible, and we knew that. We didn't separate the Bible from anything. Easy to govern people who self-govern themselves. We don't have that anymore. I mean, look at what's happening with riots in all these big cities. We no longer have the internal restraints to know what's right and wrong. And it used to be that even if you weren't a Christian person, you still knew what was right and wrong. You knew the Ten Commandments. I mean, did you know there's 53 depictions of the Ten Commandments hanging inside the U.S. Supreme Court? And that's the court that said, no, it's unconstitutional to see the Ten Commandments. Wait a minute, you got 53 depictions in your own court? And so in 1980, they took that away. Now, we just had a law.
We took it away.
Well, the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional. I actually have, in the collection, we have the copy of the Ten Commandments that went to the Supreme Court in 1980 in a case called Stone versus Graham.
Okay.
And it was 10 inches wide, 16 inches high. It listed the Ten Commandments: don't steal, don't kill, don't murder, honor your father and your mother, etc. No commentary, just listed there. And what happened was they were hanging in Kentucky schools. They would hang in the school building, not in the classrooms per se. But if you're walking down the hall, you might see a picture of a horse running through a pasture. You might see a vase of flowers, or you might see the Ten Commandments. Grab this. The Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional for students to see the Ten Commandments. Now, why can't you see them? The court said if students were to see a copy of the Ten Commandments, they would be induced to read them. And if they were to read them, they might meditate on them. And if they were to meditate on them, they might obey them, and that would be unconstitutional because those are religious teachings. Wait a minute. Don't steal and don't kill, you're calling a religious teaching? Why is it hanging? 53 depictions in the U.S. Supreme Court. So they're in the Supreme Court, and now the Supreme Court has said kids can't see what's hanging in the Supreme Court, and that was under separation of church and state. Now, the court has reversed all that. Louisiana this year signed a law putting the Ten Commandments back up in every classroom in Louisiana. The court in the last 4 years has reversed all that hostility that they had for 50 years. So now people are trying to get used to the fact that we can do things again. There are now, in the nation, there are 1,200 school districts with 200,000 students going through the Bible as a textbook in public schools. It's the only textbook in the course. It's a Bible course. It's a history course. And you got 200,000 kids in public schools doing that. Nobody's saying separation of church and state because the court has recognized.
What separation of state really mean? I mean, there's a lot of confusion on what it really means.
Is. Separation of church and state, it actually is historical, very clear historical meaning. But we goofed it up, and we screwed it up bad in 1962 and 63 when the court redefined it. So prior to 63, you got a different definition. So let's go back. Separation of church and state goes back to the Bible. When God created the Hebrew Republic, the Jews, he said, Moses, you're over all the civil laws, and Aaron, you're over all the temple laws. And there was a king one time that tried to join the temple and tried to join the civil state, King Uzziah, and God struck him down because he said, no, I have the priest to offer sacrifice, and I have the leaders to run the nation. So what happened was in 390 A.D., there was an emperor, Emperor Theodosius I. He's the head of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was the world at that time. He became a Christian. Well, good for him. When he became a Christian, he said, I have an edict to make. I'm now a Christian. You're all going to become Christians or I'm going to kill you. And so that was the edict because he rules the world. So what he did was he took the government and made everybody into one faith. And so at that point in time, he combined church and state. And so that's the way it was until the Reformation. You start in the 1500s, 1600s. And so when you get to the Pilgrims and others, when you come to America, we said, we're not going to let the government tell us what our faith has got to be. It's not that we're anti-faith, but if you were in France, you were going to be Catholic. That's the only option you got. If you're in England, you will be an Anglican because that's what the king is, and he tells everybody else. If you're in Germany, you will be a Lutheran. When you come to America, we got Catholics, we got Jews, we've got Baptists, we got Presbyterians, and so we weren't anti-God, we weren't anti-religion, but we're not going to let the government tell you what church you have to go to. That was separation of church and state. And so when Jefferson wrote that letter, January 1st, 1802, that's the separation phrase.
And that was keeping the government out of
That's it.
church.
It was keeping the government out of church, because Jefferson, if you look at what he did, he used federal funds to pay for missionaries to go for Christian Indians, because the Kaskaskia tribe said, we want Catholic priests. Would you pay for? Jefferson said, sure, we'll pay for Catholic priests. That's your choice. That's what you want. So there was no hostility. Jefferson put the Bible in the public schools of Washington, D.C. He created the school system of Washington, D.C., and the Bible is a textbook, because it's not Baptist or Presbyterian or whatever. So separation of church and state only meant the government cannot tell you what church you have to attend. That doesn't mean you take God out of anything.
Yeah.
And so that's where it all changed, and that's what's coming back. So now that this current court has said, no, that stuff was all wrong. We've had 4 cases in the last 5 years where the court said we've had it wrong for 70 years.
Okay.
What we've done for 70 years has been wrong. It's time to allow religion to return to the public square. Coach Kennedy, who wasn't allowed to pray at football games, his own prayer by himself off to the side.
I spoke with him at the Intercessors for America.
Yeah,
we spoke
good
together,
guy.
and he's a great guy.
Good guy.
Yeah.
And Marine guy as well, so connection there.
Yeah.
But the court said that was all wrong. You should be able to pray in public. You should be able to pray at school. We can't tell you where you can and can't pray. That's the government controlling your religion. So now it's all flipped. People are having a hard time getting used to it, but it's all flipped. And so it is. We're closer back to headed back to what made us great in those years.
Well, you just referenced some artifacts here and some of the things. One of the places that I personally seen this battle of church and state is in the United States military. And one of the things that I learned from you several years ago that really impacted me, because I work in the space of Mighty Oaks, right? We're dealing with our military service members who helping them prepare, being resilient. I've spoke to over 500,000 troops and on basis, and we're talking about being prepared in the 4 pillars of resiliency: mind, body, social, and spirit. And that spiritual pillar, I'm able to, and I have been able to for 500,000 troops now, been able to talk about my Christian faith and help empower them. We give away resources and books, and then we, on the recovery side, we deal with so many of our warriors after over 2 decades of war who are dealing with a suicide epidemic and depression and anxiety and PTSD and divorce rates and all this stuff. And you wonder where it all come from. And I believe it came from the weakening of the spiritual pillar in our military. And what I learned from you is that since 1776 till 2009, every service member was issued a Bible. When I went to the Marine Corps boot camp, 8 decades of service for our family. All my family members were issued a Bible, but then my 2 sons who went in the Marine Corps were not issued a Bible. Why? Because 2009, President Obama ended that, and our service members have lost their spiritual resiliency by not being given the Word of God, and their religious service and chaplains being hamstrung to preach their faith and help empower our service members to exercise their faith in the military. And I believe it's greatly impacted our military. It's why we have the suicide epidemic we have. And it's also affected our national security in a level of readiness. And I strongly believe that, by the way.
Well, you guys were also part of an empirical scientific study that went back and proved that. That's not just
right,
your
yeah.
opinion.
Yeah, Mighty Oaks, we did a third-party independent study on Mighty Oaks showing both on the resiliency and recovery side.
That's right.
And because of that, that's when President
does have
Trump...
a positive impact.
It does, yeah. Faith. And because of that, President Trump brought me on to be chairman of the White House's Faith-Based Coalition on Veteran Affairs, and we got to do the Prevents Bill and get some policy back in, although, obviously it's been stifled now until hopefully January 1st of 2025, where we could get back to where we left off and making sure our military...
The whole attitude of being faith hostile is what is real un-American.
Very
because
un-American.
What we had been for 400 years was faith friendly. And now we're faith hostile, and people think that that's the way it's always been, and that's what and teachers say that we got to enforce the faith hostile because that's what we've always been. So what made us great? No, it's not. Yeah. It's not what made us great. And so you guys with the empirical study, you and General Bob Dees and others that have now, if you take a secular path to recovery versus a spiritual path to recovery, the recovery rate is so much higher. And, the stuff we deal with in government, because you read there that we deal with legislators. We deal with, there's about 7,500 state legislators, about 1,000 of them in our network. And so it's interesting that right now, if you go through a drug rehab program, the recovery rate in a secular program is less than 20%. Recovery rate in a spiritual program is over 80%.
Yeah.
So tell me which one. As I said, the government knows this. Even with faith, there are now 15 states that have faith-based prisons. Because if you get in prison, you're going to do your time, but there is a track you can choose in prison. I want a different life. I want to get back to faith. The average recidivism rate in a prisoner, and recidivism is within 3 years, what percent of prisoners will commit a crime that put them back in prison? So that's recidivism. If you go through a faith-based program, the recidivism rate is under 15%. If you go through a secular-based program, the recidivism rate is over 85%. So if you go through a secular recovery program, 85% of those people are going to commit a crime that puts them right back in prison. If you go through a spiritual recovery program, only 15% do. That's massive change.
Yeah, we're giving Bibles out in our prisons, but not in our schools.
Yeah, exactly.
In our military.
Yeah,
and it should be the opposite.
It
should be learn a lesson from that. Can you talk about what? I mean, maybe I stole your thunder and told you about the Obama thing, but
sure.
Can you talk about how and why President Obama removed the Bibles from our military? A lot of people, I've told a lot of people that and they don't believe me. They're like, by the way, those who are listening on Spotify or Apple or wherever you're listening, you can go back to YouTube and see this. I would recommend come back because we have some real history here on the table, some amazing things that David's showing here.
This is what was given to Navy members, so Navy, Marine, etc. On the inside, it has the same letter from President Roosevelt saying, make sure you read the Bible. But on the other side, what surprised a lot of people is it has a Christian flag flying higher than the American flag. And today people say, you can't do that. American flag has to fly highest. No. To this day, in the U.S. military code, the only flag that can fly higher than the American flag is a flag calling you to divine service. Mm-hmm. So divine service, come serve God. That's what this Christian flag was. And so this is what you show. That's what you see in the World War II Bible. This is
we just so right before the show, we just contacted a fleet commander, a carrier commander. Historically, you would do that twice a day on a ship.
Yeah,
there were 2 services.
Twice a day, you'd fly the Christian flag higher, and you're calling people to come have service.
Yeah. So and now we just confirmed from a carrier commander that's only happening once a week.
Once a week.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's down to once a week.
Yeah.
So this is a Bible the same size, but if you can hear that, it is a steel cover on the Bible. This steel-plated Bible is called a pocket Bible. And this is one that soldiers would carry with them in the war, and you drop it in your breast pocket. And I've talked to 2 guys who've been in the museum that this metal cover actually stopped a bullet, a German bullet from hitting their heart. And so, one of them, it's interesting to see the bullet still inside the Bible. But this is what they carried with them was Bibles.
Now we have plate carriers with good body armor, but. I wouldn't replace it for the Bible. I wouldn't replace it for the Bible.
That's right.
Have your plate carrier and have a Bible too.
That's right. This is a Bible. It's also a pocket Bible, and this one is from World War I. You open it up, and on the inside is President Woodrow Wilson saying, "Hey, make sure you keep this Bible with you." There are also World War I Bibles that have General John Pershing, who is commander of all the military in World War I. And here's a little piece of trivia.
We're gonna get one of these from Kamala. Is she gonna put a? Kamala's gonna put a letter in front of the Bible to. I don't think so either.
And I mean, we go through these, and we can go back to the Revolution.
Can I lift this?
You bet.
Okay.
1680 is when they issued the first military Bible in the United States. And so 1680 to 2009, we had military Bibles. Obama said, no, separation church.
1680?
1680.
Okay, so 1680.
1680, Queen Anne's War was going on, and that's when we had Bibles issued.
Yeah.
And
1680.
1776, man, what Washington did. Matter of fact, I have an order over here from George Washington in the Revolution about how that if you're not fighting the enemy on Sunday, I expect you to be in divine service every Sunday morning. And so Washington does this big emphasis on chaplains, on spiritual faith, on times of prayer. He called the army times of prayer so many occasions in the Revolution. So
I think people don't know who Washington was. I mean, Washington was not the pictures, the paintings are they're beautiful and stuff like that, but they make him off to be this kind of real pretty. I mean, it's a dude that has he was like a 6'4" redhead with false teeth that are made of horse teeth, donkey teeth in there.
Yeah. When he was a young commander, when he was a lieutenant colonel, he was 23 years old. He lost his first tooth. He had gum disease, and he could not keep them. He brushed his teeth really faithfully. He had gum disease, and so when he became president in 1789, that's when his last tooth fell out. So he completely toothless when he's president. And so what they created was they made dentures for him back then. And those dentures I mean, it's like putting a small Volkswagen inside your mouth. I mean, because they made metal things to put teeth in, and they carved elephant tusk and walrus tusk, ivory teeth. There were times they could use pig's teeth. Anything to help chew food. And bless his heart.
But he's a rough dude.
Oh,
and he's a man of God, right?
I went through I had a tooth come out here last year, and I had to have a tooth implant. So implant, they drill down into your jawbone, and they screw that tooth down into your jawbone, okay? So they knocked me out cold to do that. They will not do that surgery with locals. They're going to knock you out cold because it's too painful. We have Washington sitting for several drillings with them implanting teeth in his jaw, and they would last 2 to 3 years and then come out. So you're talking about, here's a guy sitting there, and they're drilling down into his jawbone with him sitting there with no anesthesia at all. And they put that tooth in, and it works for 2 or 3 years. I mean, this is a tough dude. This is he's got more manhood than I can think of with stuff like that and what he went through. But he also was a very, very spiritual guy. He had an hour a day that he read Bible, and you do not interrupt him during his Bible reading time. And he would that was the rule at Mount Vernon, his home, not Martha, not the kids, not anybody. And I say kids, he didn't have kids. He had grandkids that he raised his kids. You know, kind of what it is to raise that second family. And so Washington, he had an hour a day, Bible and prayer, and you just don't interrupt him. And he tried to do that in the field as well, but actually have a drawing over there when Washington served as chaplain, because there was a time when the commander was shot and they didn't have a chaplain. Washington did the funeral service, had the prayers. He led the soldiers in chaplain services throughout the week. So he's a very strong guy. We see at Valley
Forge, right? This is one of his famous prayer times is Valley Forge.
If you go to the lithograph of Washington praying at Valley Forge, you'll see a guy looking around a tree, and that face looking around the tree, Washington kneeling in prayer. And Washington's by himself except for this face. And that face is named Isaac Potts. And Isaac Potts is the guy who said, hey, I saw him praying. And people today say, oh, there's no Isaac Potts. You know, in our museum, we actually have the title deed signed by Isaac Potts for his land in Mount Vernon. Yes, he was a real person. It's not a fake. He's there. And so there are so many of those stories about the faith of these guys. And Pershing is the same way. Pershing, throughout World War I, he had a huge emphasis on spiritual fitness with his soldiers. You'll find the same thing with Patton. Nobody thinks about Patton in this way. Got time to share a story on Patton?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you got some pictures of Patton here, right?
For those that can see it, I'm going to pull out this magazine on Patton right here.
And I'm gonna help plug the show right here while you're pulling it out. If you do go to YouTube, then you just subscribe to YouTube so you can catch a lot of these episodes. It's great to listen to, but really fun to watch, especially with stuff like this.
So let me pull this out here very gently.
Yeah, I'm scared to touch your stuff.
Yeah, I'm like
a caveman. I'm like break things real easy.
So you can kind of see here. There's Patton in prayer.
Yeah.
So let's back up to Patton. Patton is a very coarse guy, very rough and tumble guy. He has a huge heart, but he talked about when he was training soldiers at Fort Benning, because let's back up for a little bit. So World War I is called the war to end all wars. There were so many people killed in World War I. It was so bad. Nobody wanted another war. And so America took the position that if we don't prepare for war, nobody will attack us because we're not a threat to anybody. And so when World War II broke out, when we got hit at Pearl Harbor, we're still flying biplanes from World War I. We're still using old ships. I mean, it was our position. So from the time we got hit in December the 7th of 1941, we did not attack the Germans until 11 months later. And it was all about getting our resources built. So we started turning out a B-24 bomber every 55 minutes off the assembly line. We turned out a Liberty ship every 4 days. I mean, it was great what we did mobilization, but we weren't prepared. So the first time we do anything in World War II in Europe is Patton. He leads Operation Torch, where we come ashore in Casablanca, Northwest Africa, and we work our way. Patton, that's where he meets Rommel, defeats Rommel. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was a disaster. They put Patton in charge of it. He won the battle. And then we get over and we get into Sicily and we're going up through Italy and we're getting closer to D-Day. And at that point in time, the Germans have learned that wherever Patton is, you keep your eyes on Patton, because Patton does not lose battles. He just absolutely doesn't lose them. And Patton was real rough rough guy, really coarse language. He said, the more I cussed, the more they got the point. And so in Fort Benning, he was the biggest cusser of anybody out there. And so as he gets through, they take him to D-Day over into what is called Operation Fortitude. And so for D-Day, they put him over in England, and all the Germans are watching him in England, saying wherever Patton is, that's where the attack's coming. And they put him in Calais, which is 23 miles from Dover, France. And so that's how the Germans knew that we're going to have D-Day hit us from Dover over to Calais, France. And actually, Patton was just a fake. The whole D-Day operation happened hundreds of miles away, beaches at Normandy. But Hitler pulled about half of his troops up to be ready to face Patton. So we lost 3,000 guys at D-Day. We would have lost a whole lot more if he hadn't pulled half those troops out. So now that D-Day's happened, once they get it secured and get the beaches secured, then they fly in Patton to take control, and he's now going to push Hitler back into Germany. So they have the First Army and the Third Army. Patton's now with the Third Army, and the First Army is Courtney Hodges. And so they're going to create a 600-mile front, and they're going to push Hitler back into Germany, and that's 600 miles. And so the southern part of the line is where Patton is with the Third Army. The northern part of the line is Courtney Hodges. And Patton's got great intelligence. His intelligence is it was equal to Eisenhower's intelligence. And so Patton's guys start coming to him and say, hey, General, that crack Nazi tank unit has disappeared. We can't find them anywhere. We don't know where. And they keep finding these units disappearing, and Patton says, you know what they're doing? They're getting ready to do an attack on the First Army up north of us, and if they break through and get behind Courtney Hodges, then he'll be frozen. He can't move. He said, all right, I want everybody prepared to go help Courtney Hodges because he's about to get attacked and doesn't know it. And so sure enough, the Blitzkrieg happens, and what's called the Battle of the Bulge. 1,800 German tanks and 250,000 Germans broke through the American lines. They came in a part of the Alps that nobody thought they could get to, which is why they attacked there. That's where Courtney Hodges had the men that were really tired and needed some rest. He put them there because nothing's going to happen there. Well, that's where they got attacked. And so that's where Bastogne, and it becomes the center of that. And so at that point in time, Patton is really ticked. And he called his chaplains in. This is before Battle of the Bulge. He called his chaplains in. He said, guys, he said, we've gone through 6 weeks of bad weather. I need the weather to change. And to put it in perspective, of the 12 tanks that were used in World War II, we had the Sherman tank. And that was only number 8 out of the 12. We weren't a very good tank. It was great if you're taking on bazookas or machine guns, but it's not great taking on German tanks. So all the German tanks, the Panzers and the Tigers, all better than our tanks. And so what Patton found out was he could take P-51 Mustang planes and P-47 Thunderbolt planes and blow up their tanks and then use our tanks to take out their bazookas and others. And so as long as we had planes in the air, we were winning the battles. But now he's coming to a European winter where there've been 6 weeks straight of rain, and he can't get any plane in the air. He's having a lot of casualties. Their tanks are taking out our tanks really handily. And so he calls in the chaplains, and he tells the chaplains, he said, have you guys got a prayer for weather? And it was particularly his chief of chaplains, which is James O'Neill. He said, chaplain, you got a prayer for weather? And O'Neill said, let me look. And he went through the prayer books. He came back and said, I can't find a prayer for weather. I'll write you one. And he said that Patton turned his back on him, went over to the window, looked out the window at all the rain coming down, and he said, chaplain, he said, do our men pray? And O'Neill said, well, certainly, sir. We have chaplains. We have services. He said, I didn't ask if the chaplains prayed. I asked the men pray. He said, well, there's no atheists in Fox. Sure, they pray. He said, no, I'm not. He said, I want to know right now. We have 250,000 men in this army. Are they praying about the weather right now? And he said, no, sir, but I'll write you that prayer. So he read out the prayer. This is the prayer card. You can see here, signed by Patton on the back. Here's what it says. It's a prayer. And by the way, You can see the holly going down the side. This is how they spent Christmas of 1944. And so that on the back side is signed by Patton, and it's a Merry Christmas card. This is Merry Christmas from Patton. But on the front it says, Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we've had to contend. God grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among the nations. Amen. So this is the prayer, and he said, I want all 250,000 guys praying this. So this is as
I
a
need a prayer for vision because you just read the.
Yeah,
You're older than me. And
your eyes. We'll get you some glasses, Chad. So they come out with this, but it takes them a while to print it. So in the meantime, he's been called up to help Courtney Hodges, and he sets up his headquarters at Luxembourg because he's now in charge of Battle of the Bulge.
Right.
And so it sets it up at Luxembourg, and his practice was over these 6 weeks, as they would advance and take towns and they would take villages, he would stop in all the churches and go in and have a conversation with Jesus. And his officers would go in with him, and what he would do, and the churches in Europe at that time are what we call high churches. So they're really high visuals, to be like a Catholic church or an Episcopal church here. A lot of statues, a lot of stained glass, a lot of awesome stuff to see. What Patton would do is he would walk in, he would walk up the statue of Jesus, he would take his helmet, put it under his arm, and he would stand there and say, "Sir, here's what happened last week. Last week we beat the German," and he would just go through, and just like he's briefing Eisenhower, he would tell Jesus about it. He said, "Sir, next week I'm going to be over here. I really need your help," and he would tell him where he was going to be. And so he did this town after town after town. So when he got to Luxembourg, he went into the church at Luxembourg, and that's the painting I just showed you, because all of his staff wrote down all of his prayers because he got ticked at Jesus, started cussing Jesus out. And he said, "Where are you? I need your help. Why aren't you helping me on this?" And so he really got ticked, and they wrote it all down. And afterwards, they showed it to him and said, "Is that what you?" He said, "That's what I said." So it was confirmed by him. So he cussed out Jesus real good and said, if you'll give me 4 days of good weather, just give me 4 days of good weather, I'll send you more Germans than your bookkeepers in heaven can keep up with. That's how many they'll kill. And so what happened was, they started, that's when they issued this prayer card. So 250,000 guys started praying. They got this card. He has just had the prayer with Jesus. And we have the after-action report of the Third Army, all their after-action stuff. And there is 6 straight days after his prayer where the weather completely clears. And the forecast was not for clear weather. And we have the forecast, we have the weather guys from Great Britain, from Australia, from the Allied forces, from America, all saying, and the word they use is, "This is a miracle. The weather's completely clear today. We don't know why. This is a miracle." And 6 days in a row. So he got planes in the air, destroyed all the German tanks, and saved the Battle of the Bulge. So after the battle was over, he stopped back by the church and went and talked to Jesus again and apologized to him for how he'd cussed him out before. So, but Patton, you don't think of him as a guy of faith, but he really was, and he was a coarse guy, but my goodness. And so that's that painting. That's a World War II painting. Done in True magazine back then.
What else? You got a few other things.
There's a lot of stuff here, and I brought a lot of military stuff. But I want to go back to America for a bit, just George Washington, because the faith side is so important. This I'm holding here. This is a newspaper from 1789, and the reason why it's important, it's George Washington up top with an announcement here, and they've just finished the Bill of Rights. So our first 10 amendments. They've just finished framing the Bill of Rights, and George Washington says, "This is so significant, we need to have a national day of prayer and thanksgiving. We need to stop and thank God." And so what I want to read is, why does George Washington think we need to stop and thank God? And his opening statement, he said, here's why we're doing this prayer. He says, "It is the duty of all nations," and emphasize the word duty there, because if you look up the word duty in our dictionaries today, it says that which you ought to do. So, I ought to do something. Well, if you look up duty in their dictionaries, it says a legally binding contractual obligation. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
So he says it's a duty, and it's a legally binding contractual obligation of all nations, not individuals. We're talking political bodies. He said it's the duty of all nations to listen to his 4 verbs, to number 1, acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. So it's the duty of nations to stop and acknowledge that there is a God. No secular stuff in that. He says, number 2, to obey his will. Number 3, to be grateful for his benefits. And number 4, humbly to implore his protection and favor. So Washington says, look, this is what a nation has an obligation to do. You've got to acknowledge God. You've got to obey his will. And so how do you go from that to separation church and state, where a kid can't say the word God at graduation? How do you get from the duty? And it's because we don't know our history. And so the Founding Fathers, the intention they had was they knew that we couldn't be blessed without God's help. And this, by the way, this is George Washington's order that he gave on divine service on, look, if you're fighting for the army, and if we're not fighting an enemy on Sunday, you will be in church on Sunday. So this is actually issued by Abraham Lincoln, quoting Washington. So this is Lincoln's order as commander-in-chief in the Civil War, saying, hey, you remember what Washington said back then? That's the policy now in the military. And so it was always a faith-centered policy. And certainly we had a lot of guys in the military that weren't faith guys.
Sure.
But we didn't ever hide the faith factor. We didn't have to have it in a closet. We didn't have to pretend like that's the weird guys. That wasn't the weird guys. That was the mainstream normal part of America. And that's what schools were. So all this stuff here, Chad, these are all stories about it. Awesome stories. Eisenhower, God performed a literal miracle in Eisenhower when he was 13 years old. He would not have been in the military without that miracle. And Eisenhower used to tell that story as president. He would acknowledge that story as president. And when Eisenhower went in as president, he writes, he said, I was really concerned that America was becoming too secular. And he said, I thought to myself, what can I do to help it not be secular? He said, well, I'm not a preacher, so I can't preach a sermon, but I am president. And so he started off with this piece right here. If you look up,
that's like an original, it's got scratches on it.
That is original from Eisenhower. That is his handwriting. And if you look up on YouTube, the inauguration of Eisenhower, right after he is sworn in, the Chief Justice is sworn him in on the Bible, he walks up and he's getting ready to deliver his inaugural address. And he says to everybody bow your heads. And then he prayed his own inaugural prayer. This is his handwritten inaugural prayer. He said, I'm not a preacher, I can't, but he said, but I can pray. And so then after that, he gets into this thing of what can I do to help America not become secular? And there were 5 laws he passed. So he's the one who passed the law. It's right here. He passed the law to add under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. So that every time we say the pledge, we think about God. We're one nation under God. He also is the one who had, "In God We Trust," become the national motto. So that's our national motto. That's Eisenhower. He's also the one who had "In God We Trust" put on every piece of money. It was put on 2-cent coins back in the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln put "In God We Trust" on some money, but he said, no, every piece of currency we're going to do. He set up a prayer chapel in the U.S. Congress, and the Capitol building is a terrific prayer chapel, so that we would have prayer there. And he also established the International Prayer Breakfast. So first Thursday of February every year up to now, we gather in Washington, D.C. and have times of prayer. And people come from about 140 different nations to that time of prayer in D.C. All the political leaders gather. President speaks to the group. One of my good friends, who's now deceased just a couple months ago, Senator Jim Inhofe out of Oklahoma, for whatever reason, he really felt responsible to do everything he could to help African nations. So he made 137 different trips to Africa, meeting with their national leaders. And there's so many civil wars in Africa. And he would go over and say, guys, he said, look, if you guys would just turn to God, he would help you with this. And so he has led dozens of African leaders to become Christians, relationship with Christ. And 3 civil wars in Africa, he got stopped because he got both sides to agree to come to Washington, D.C. to that prayer breakfast, and they prayed together. And once the leaders started praying together, they stopped fighting each other. So that's the kind of stuff Eisenhower started. But this, I have a picture here of Eisenhower, and you can see it, Chad, on that side. And for people that have the visual of it, this is Eisenhower right here when this is a 1902 picture. This is when he's 12 years old. He was quite an athlete. In high school, he turned out to be a really good athlete, football player. But these are all boys in the family, and the mother Ida and the father David. And he was born in Texas. He grew up in Kansas, and he was coming home from school one day, and he fell and scuffed his knee up. And, it's like every parent, get up, wash it, shake it off, you're fine. He did, except in his case, it started getting infected. And so when they were going to church that Monday, this was on a Friday, they're going to church on Sunday morning, and he goes in to his parents and said, my leg, it hurts so bad, it hurts. And they said, okay, you can stay home from church today. We'll look at it when we get home tonight. They went to church all day long. So they got home that night, and they looked at the leg, and they literally had to cut the pants to get it off. His leg was so swollen, they had to cut his boot to get it off, and it was just blown up and inflamed and discolored, and it's streaking going up into his body. And so they call for the family doctor, Dr. Conklin, and it's horse and buggy time. And so he comes in horse and buggy. He gets there. They have Dwight upstairs in an upstairs bedroom, and Dwight is delirious, high fever, infection going in and out of delirium. And doctor goes in, examines him, steps outside the room, talks to the parents, Ida and David. He says, well, it's really bad, but I think I can save his life. He said, but I've got to take that leg off. I've got to get that infection away from him. He's young enough. He can fight off the infection, but I got to take his leg. And they said, save his life. Do what you got to do. It happened that Dwight was awake and heard that conversation. And so what happens is when Conklin goes back downstairs, he's going back to his office literally to get the hand saw to saw off the leg. So he's on his way back to get the saw, and Dwight yells, Edgar, come here. And Edgar's the older brother. So Edgar's over here. Edgar right there. He says, Edgar, come here. And Edgar goes in. He says, Edgar, he says, you promise me no matter what happens, you don't let them take my leg off. And Edgar's like, Dwight, man, we got to save your life. Promise you won't let. And so they go back and forth. And finally Edgar said, okay, I promise I won't let them take your leg. So when Conklin came back, he goes upstairs and Edgar's blocking the door and says, sorry, Doc, you can't go in. Edgar, I've got to get in there to treat your brother. It's really bad. I've got to save his life. I'm sorry, Doc. I can't let you go in. Edgar, you're not understanding. This is serious stuff. I've got to. I'm sorry, Doc. Edgar, if you don't get out of the way, your brother's going to die, and you will be his murderer because you won't let me go save his life. I'm sorry, Doc. Gave my word. You can't. And so Conklin, really outraged, goes back downstairs. He slams the door as he goes out, and as he slams the door, he says, the only thing that will save this boy's life is a miracle. Slam, and he's gone. Well, that hit Mom and Dad because Ida and David, their parents both had been missionaries out to the Wild West frontier, out with the trappers and the frontiers guys. And so they really got serious about prayer, got around Dwight, really focused on it. And a day later, it looks like it's actually getting better. And 2 days later, it's definitely getting better. And so 2 weeks, Dwight's back to himself and has his leg. And so they talked to Conklin later. He said, that's definitely a miracle. And so Dwight would tell that story as president, how God spared his leg. And the other, you might like this as a Marine, but he goes in the Army. His goal from when he was a kid was to join the Navy. Now, how do you grow up in the middle of Kansas and want to be in the Navy? You don't even know what water is in Kansas. So he ended up putting his brother Edgar through college because Edgar saved his life and he wanted to help Edgar. And so when he finally gets done with all the stuff, he's too old to go in the Navy. He's too old to go in the Marines. The only thing they'll accept him is the Army. And so he ends up in the Army and sure enough becomes the commander-in-chief over the European theater and does all this innovative stuff. He was thinking outside the box all the time, and the way he used Pat and everything else. So there's another faith story that is so big, and everybody used to know that about Dwight Eisenhower. They knew how the inaugural started with him praying prayer. They knew about the prayer room in the Capitol, and they knew about Under God and the Pledge of Allegiance. Nobody knows that today. Yeah. And this is just common for who we are, and now people act like religion's weird. It's just not.
So so he's a implementer of the In God We Trust. I don't know the year this happened, but it's recent years. If you look at the quarter,
yes,
In God We Trust, George Washington is facing it, and in recent years, his back's turned towards it.
Yeah,
and a new mint.
Yeah, they minted it differently. Yeah, and there was one sit that went through the mint where they didn't put In God We Trust on the money. There's actually minted coins that came out without that, and that was that was just unthinkable any previous generation.
Right,
and that's why it's good to recover our history.
The quarter today is, if you go look at your quarters today, if it's a 2024 coin,
yeah,
George Washington's back will be turned towards the In God We Trust.
Yeah.
Where it wasn't that way.
And that was not that way. And that certainly is not who Washington was. And just, to make it really clear on this stuff, George Washington has more than 100 volumes of published writings. I challenge you to go into any one of those 100 volumes and find anything that is hostile to faith at all. Yeah. Because that's what we get told today. It's what our school board attorneys get told. That's what parents get told. It's just not. Jefferson's got 80 volumes of letters. Madison's got 80 volumes. Franklin's got nearly 100. Madison's got 60. Just find anybody. Find any of them that are hostile to faith. You're just not going to find it, not even Franklin. And so somehow America has bought into a lie that we're better off being secular. And, there's nothing wrong with people being secular if they want to, but that's just not what the nation's been. That's never who we've been, ever.
Yeah, that's one of the rights and freedoms that founding fathers gave us, was the right to not be subject to a religion or mandatory religion by the
Choose
state,
your own religion. That's the First Amendment.
But the founding clearly is under Christian structuring.
Because we've seen the founding fathers under attack for about 60 years. And part of it was, they were atheists, agnostics, deists. Well, that's nonsense. They're immoral. Well, that's nonsense. They're all a bunch of slaveholders. It's nonsense. Yeah, some of them held slaves, but the overwhelming majority didn't. And if you look at the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, the longest clause in there is condemning the slave trade and wanting to end slavery. And 11 of the 13 colonies voted for that. But it had to be unanimous to go in the Declaration. So 11 of 13 want slave trade ended, et cetera. We never hear that anymore. We never hear how many founding fathers started abolition societies. So they've been under attack for 60 years, and because we are such a bad history nation today, we just don't go back to sources. We don't look at originals. We bought a bunch of lies, and those lies make you behave ways you really wouldn't if you know what the truth was.
So the lies say America's bad. We know they're lies. So what makes America good? What makes America exceptional? I believe in American exceptionalism. What makes America exceptional?
American exceptionalism, there's several things you can point to. Number one is, we talked earlier, longevity. So we're 200 and now 237 years old. So that's exceptional. And by exceptional, it's not that, look at me, I'm exceptional. I'm special. No. We're the exception. We're not the rule. We're different from other nations. So we can take that as one way that we're exceptional. We have stability when other nations lack stability. We don't have the wars other nations do.
So I want some clarity on that, because we're 237 or 249 years independent. There's nations that have been around longer. Britain, what makes us different than Britain?
Britain's never had a constitution. Britain has gone through monarchs, and they have not had the freedoms we've had. We've had these freedoms for 237 years.
We're the longest standing right now.
We're the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world. Now, if you want a monarchy, Great Britain's been around longer, but they didn't have individual freedoms. They didn't have the right to private property. They didn't have the right to lots of stuff.
Clearly, they don't still right now.
That's right. That's right. And that even now they don't have. So, and to put it in perspective, France is a constitutional republic. They had their revolution in 1789. Same time we have our constitution go into effect. They've had 15 constitutions since we've had one. Brazil has had 19 constitutions since 1821. You look at every other nation with the constitution, and they don't last long. But we have 237 years. So as a constitutional republic, we're the longest ongoing in the world. When it comes to individual, let's take even things like creativity. If you measure creativity by copyright and patent protections, things like that, every year America produces more inventions than the rest of the world combined. So we are surrounded with all sorts of elite technology that we just take for granted the rest of the world does not have. So every year we create more patents, copyright, patent protection, et cetera, than all the other nations. If you look at where we are economically, we are 4% of the world's population. We produce 25% of the world's wealth. So we way outproduce every other nation. And some proper questions should be, why is that? And we can get to that in a second. But then when you look at individual stuff, every 10 years we do a census in America. We've done it since 1790. And so it looks at economics and income and everything else. And what you find is, in America, if you look at those that we call poverty, or the poor in America, if you are in the poverty class in America, your lifestyle is higher than middle class in Europe, literally. You're more likely to have a car, you're more likely to have TVs, you're more likely to have internet, you're more likely to have all the stuff as a poor person than what middle class does in Europe. So, and again, that's a study that comes out every 4 years. Robert Rector, Heritage Foundation, does that study. Looks at all the
probably the top 10% of the world, right?
We are
poverty
continually,
poverty,
and we criticize ourselves like we're the slum. We talk about we're the slugs of the world, and we ought to be ashamed of ourselves for all the bad stuff we've done to everybody. And we just, it's like having a beautiful person go to a mirror and all they see is one pimple, and they forget what the whole face looks like and all the beauty that's there. And that's what's happened to America. We focus on the pimple and we've missed the rest.
We're also the most generous in giving.
We are the most generous, hands down in giving. And
we, for those who say that we're closing our borders and all that stuff, all the tax we get for standing up for our border and legal immigration, on the legal side, not talking about opening our border, we allow for the most immigration.
We do. We've always been open immigration, but you see, it's like If I'm going to let a kid come live in my house while he's going to college, I want him to at least agree with my rules while he's going to be here. And that's everybody does
Rule
that.
number one is don't break in the front door.
Don't break. That's exactly right.
Rule number one, right?
And so, we've never been anti-immigration. Matter of fact, one of the clauses in the Declaration why we separated from Great Britain was stopping immigration in America. And that was one of our grievances is we want immigration, but we want to make sure people understand. It's interesting. Of the 39 guys who wrote the Constitution, 9 of them were foreign immigrants. And they're the ones who put the clause in the Constitution about you have to be here 5 years before you can vote. And one of them, a guy named Butler, came out of Scotland. He said, if I'd voted when I got to America, he said, I would have turned America into Scotland. He said, I really think you need about 14 years. He said, I think it takes you about 14 years to learn to think like an American, and you shouldn't be voting until you learn to think like an American. So it was the founding fathers who were the immigrants who had come from foreign nations. They're the ones who put the time limit on because they said, otherwise you'll turn America into all the other nations and you won't have a place to go. You'll lose it all. And so that's why they require you have to be here 9 years before you can be a senator and 5 years before you can be a congressman. And you have to have 5 years before you can vote. And it was learning to think. And so it's not that America's anti-immigration. It says that we're inviting in all these people who are hostile to everything we believe. And we survive because of our unique ideas, not because we're a particular piece of geography.
Yeah.
If we take those ideas away, we don't survive anymore. We exist because of that. And so, of concern right now, I was just talking to a major general the other day, and he was pointing out, he said, right now, we don't know what all the gotaways are. But what we do know is there are now more military-aged men who have come across the border illegally than
without families.
Without families. Single military-aged men have come across the border illegally than the entire number of U.S. military forces we have active right now.
That's right.
We got a bigger army in America than what the U.S. military is. And that ought to be a concern to somebody. But if you got
the last 3.5 years this happened. And we're mainly in the last 3.5 years. And this is like Border Patrol agents, the head of the Border Patrol Union is saying this. These are...
And I don't care what party you are. That ought to concern you as an American.
Some of them are standing at positions of attention when they get... Like, these are military
trained.
People.
Absolutely.
China, Syria.
That's right.
All parts of the Middle East. They're coming across. And we, by the way, not only did they come here illegally, we don't even know where they are.
Yeah. Once they get here, we don't track. We have no idea.
So you said something about survivability. And historically, there's a thing called this 250-year life cycle for most powerful nations in history. And so right now we're at 249 years of independence and 237 years of a constitutional republic. We're at that 250-year mark. Does America surpass that?
Yeah, I mean, this next election is as cataclysmic as anything we've had in our lifetime because it is an absolute. It's not Republican versus Democrat. This is a worldview difference. This is a complete worldview difference.
Yeah, I say it's not Republican, Democrat, it's conservative, liberal. This is good versus evil at this point.
This is good versus evil.
It's been so clear that when you're choosing a side, that's why you see a lot of people actually standing up and jumping out. Like some of these Hollywood elites that you never thought in a million years would be pro-Trump. They're switching over because I think they've pushed the line so far. It's good versus evil.
Well, one of the things that we're very aware of because we deal with state legislators, and so we've had states having to try to help preserve American sovereignty. So much now in this administration, we have adopted the policies globally written by global banks, by the health policies, the economic policies, the World Economic Forum. President Biden has taken that and said they're in charge. And actually, we have told them they will be in charge in just a few years.
The World Economic Forum.
That's right.
In charge of the United States.
In charge of the United States.
Yeah.
And so what you have is you have a group that they want us to be part of the world. And then you have a group that says, no, we'll be part of the world, but we want to be our own nation. We want to be sovereign and independent. So this is really a sovereignty kind of a thing versus a globalist kind of a thing. And literally what we're finding in education is become more and more global, less and less American ideals. America is different, and we have different ideas, and that's why we are different. And we need to preserve those ideas.
That's why people are trying to flood to come here still.
They want to come here, and we're trying to take those ideas away. It's just oxymoronic. People want to get here because our ideas are different, and that's what they want. And we who have lived here, especially progressives, are saying, no, that's what makes us bad. No, I don't want to be like the other nations of the world. I'm very grateful that God has allowed me to be here, and I want everybody else to have the freedoms we have, but you got to think the right way to get it.
How do you convince people that they're not voting for Donald Trump or Kamala Harris? Because that's what people think. They're voting for Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, but ultimately you're voting for sovereignty or becoming part of the under control of the World Economic Forum and giving up all of what America is. How do you convince people of that are so stuck on this?
There's a couple of things I would point to. Is the least important person in federal government today in some ways is the president, because the president will not get his agenda done. And that's because back a number of years ago, the U.S. Senate did something it should never have done, and it went to a filibuster rule. And that filibuster rule says you can't get a policy passed in the Senate. Now, there's 100 members of the Senate, and they say you can't get a policy passed unless 60 people agree with it. So that filibuster, they said that way we'll have unity. No. What you've just done is you've just messed up, because now 41 can beat 59 every day of the week. The minority runs everything that happens in the Senate. So 41 senator, and I was talking to a senator just a couple weeks ago. I said, is there anything that can get passed into law without having to go through the filibuster rule? And she said, absolutely not. There's not even economics, not budget, nothing. So as long as you've got 41 dissenters, they can kill what 59 senators want to do. So you can have the will of the nation with 59. You can have 59% of the nation support something, and it won't become policy because the 41% has greater power. So when a president comes in, here's my agenda, he's not going to get none of it done. And in this place and time, there's not a single thing that the president's going to get 59 votes on, 60 votes.
Which is why I see more executive orders.
That's why you see more executive orders. But what a president will do is what he stops. There's two things he can do. It's what he stops. Like when Trump went in, he said, and for people who don't understand regulations, federal regulations, Mike Lee, U.S. Senator from Utah, Mike is a great constitutionalist. And he says, the Constitution says for something to become federal law, it has to go through the House and the Senate and be signed by the president. And so he keeps a box in his office where he puts all the laws that have been, if they went through the House, Senate, president signed it, he puts it in that box. But we also have federal agencies that make laws now, and they're just as important. You'll go to jail for violating an agency rule. It didn't come through House, didn't come through Senate. Constitution says House, Senate, President. So last year, I think it was, in the box with the laws, there was like 127, and I guess it's 4 years ago, 127, and it came up about 2 feet high. On the other side, the agency laws was more than 14 feet high, and it was not voted on by any person elected in the United States. It was not voted. It was just agency laws. So
is that unconstitutional?
It should be.
Yeah.
But and we'll come to that in a minute. So what happens with agency laws, Chad, right now, you're liable for every one of those agency laws. They can arrest you at any point in time if you violate them. So you really need to read the agency laws, because that it's part of the regulatory
all 14 feet high of them.
Well, that's just 1 year.
Yeah.
If you read 700 pages a week of those laws, do you know how long it would take you to finish?
A lifetime?
25,000 years. That's how much paper we have now in laws. That's why they can prosecute you for anything. If they decide they want you, they will take you down, because we have so many laws. And so what happens is, when Trump came in, he said, you cannot, every executive order for all the agencies, you cannot issue any new regulation unless you repeal 2. You have to take 2 off the books for everyone. Well, that's a good start. That's something a president can do. He can't get that done through Congress, but he can do that. Kamala Harris, there's no way. She's going to say, write 10 new ones for every one you do. So Trump already said, no, we want it smaller. So he limited the EPA. The EPA has been running farmers' lands for a long time. Farmers should be running their own lands, but all these agencies run the lands. So that's one thing, is the president will come in and he can stop agencies from expanding.
Yeah, because when you're talking about laws, you're not talking about like violent crimes or things like that. You're talking about like everyday Americans farming, building homes,
That's
like
right.
those laws.
That's right.
Those laws.
Ranch we had here in Central Texas, raised cattle on it, and my biggest thing was fighting the cedars. Cedars take over the property in Central Texas. They're not an indigenous plant. They drink 40 gallons of water a day, each cedar. And so I would spend time cutting cedars so the cattle would have grazeland. And then the federal government came in and said, hey, we think that somewhere on your property may be a yellow-breasted warbler. You're not allowed to cut any more cedars. What do you mean I can't cut cedars? That's my cattle crop. Yeah, but we think there's yellow-breasted warbler there somewhere. It's not your land. We'll see environmentally, they've given themselves the right to go into any land, go into any property. A game warden can go into anybody, check anything without probable cause. Constitution says you can't go into somebody's private property without probable cause. You have to have a judicially issued warrant that says probable cause. Game warden walk in at any point in time and say, hey, you're in trouble.
If you have a lock on it, they'll cut the lock.
And they see, and that's all agency stuff. That's not Constitution stuff. So what happens is a president is not going to be able to pass a law, but they can stop a bunch of stuff. And more importantly is the kind of judges you get. I talked about the fact we're starting to get some religious liberties back in America. Hostility's gone. That's because President Trump put 3 Supreme Court justices on that actually read the Constitution. It's a novel idea. We talk about the Chevron deference thing. Chevron deference is the court saying, hey, Chevron deference, that's agencies making law. It should be the Congress that makes law. That's a huge decision from the Supreme Court to say we're going back to constitutional law rather than agency law. So all of that comes from a president, and President Trump is not going to get anything passed that he wants. What he will do is he will stop the expansion of the bad stuff. He will give us judges that will start rolling back the bad stuff. And that's what we've seen. The Roe v. Wade decision.
Well, this is the America First thing, right?
It's America First.
Yeah,
It is America First.
People have token that as a Christian nationalist, neo-Nazi idea, American First, but we can't. America can't be strong for the world unless we're strong here first, right?
There's a reason America has done so well. Mm-hmm. And if we remove the reason and the cause, it's not going to do as well. We'll be like every other nation in the world. If we're going to act like every other nation, we will be like every other nation. We've always been different. We've always had a different standard. We've always been very God-honoring. We've been we believed in, the Declaration talks about the laws of nature, nature's God. And by the way, let's just back up for a minute to the Declaration, because people do say it's not really religious. It kind of say, only mentions God 4 times. Right up front, it talks about that there is a creator God. And then after it talks about the creator God.
Where does it say that? No.
At the beginning, it says we're endowed by our creator with certain inalienable rights. So there is a creator. The creator gives certain inalienable rights to man. And the creator establishes the laws of nature, nature's God, which is that is a moral law. Just take an example. Right now, if you go to Helpful Professors, a website here in America, you will find that according to our Helpful Professors, there are 81 different genders in America. If you want to come to my ranch, I'll let you get behind my cattle herd, and you'll find there's only 2 genders. And it's really not difficult to tell which there is.
Well, in the LGBT, the B kind of clarifies this too, right?
Well,
bisexual.
It's supposed to, but they don't think that way.
Right.
LGBTQIA plus. But you get into this thing where the laws of nature, nature's God tells you what rights and wrongs are. And part of that is there are moral rights and wrongs. So the laws of nature, it's self-defense. You show me something in nature that's not going to defend itself when attacked. It will defend itself. That's a law of nature. That's why we have the Second Amendment. We have the right to keep and bear arms because that's a law of nature, the right of self-defense that comes from God. Try finding the right of self-defense in France. Try finding the right of self-defense in Italy. Try finding God-given. See, we're different because we acknowledge that, hey, there's the Declaration. There is a creator. The creator gives you certain inalienable rights. There are moral rights and wrongs, the laws of nature, nature's God, and government exists to protect inalienable rights. That's the 4 things in the Declaration. So government exists to protect my right to acknowledge God or not acknowledge God. My government exists to protect my right to defend myself, my right to private property, my right to my own home. There's the 4th Amendment is huge, and it's ignored by most federal agencies now because they will come into your home and take what they want, and they can't do that without all sorts of specifications in the 4th Amendment. And that's where a president will have impact. You get judges that will get us back to the Constitution, then you can get regulatory agencies under control. So you ask the question about Kamala and Trump, neither one of them are going to get their policies through by law. They will get them through by agencies. And it's, do you want them to be imposed on you, or do you want to respect constitutional rights? And I think that's a big choice.
I think so too, yeah. So the question was actually, will America break the 250-year curse of, and I think your answer was
depends on who's
the president.
Right.
And I agree with this. Every election cycle we say this is the most important election, but I never think there's been a time more than this one.
We keep getting closer to the cliff every election, you know? We keep not going over it, but we're closer.
This one could push us over.
This one, there's not much ground to go before you fall over.
Do you think, you'd have to be insane to to say otherwise, that President Trump is the popular president in this race. No way that in a free and fair election that President Trump doesn't win. Do you think that President Trump, despite, election fraud and election integrity, all this stuff, mail-in ballots, do you think that is it possible for President Trump to have this election stolen from him?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, an article came out again this week on another election system where they found logarithms in it. Now, let me explain logarithm because I'm a math science guy. Logarithm is not a matter of adding votes. It adds a percentage of votes. So if I tell you, Chad, every vote that people cast for you, the machine is automatically going to cast 1.01% for me. So you can't overwhelm the machines because I get always 100% higher than what you get. So if they come in 58 million for you, I'm going to 58 million plus 100% higher, which is going to make me 58,558,000. So I'll be 58,000 higher than you. So with a logarithm, you can never beat the logarithm. And we've seen now in the last year, national news, they have found logarithms in two of the voting systems. And one, it was interesting. They were looking for them, and they were looking in the wrong places. They finally found the key to get into the logarithm system and find out how it worked. And so some of the guys online did demonstrations. They broke into the systems. They changed the votes, and they erased the fact that they were there. Nobody could tell they were there.
Where are the systems? When I say where are the systems, where would the systems have an impact on this election? Like what state? Is it states? Is it regional?
One of them is used in are the 2,100 counties in the United States, and one of them is used in 721 of those counties. So about a third of this, and it happens to be in all the battleground states.
Yeah.
But hopefully what happens is the fact that this made news and it's now got some sunlight on it. Sunlight is still the best disinfectant. The fact that it's now people are aware out there, there's more people looking at it and monitoring. But you can never stop people from doing wrong if they want to do wrong. I mean, it's just the way it is. And so even as we were working with groups, we were working in Michigan, and anybody, by public law, you can have the voter rolls and look at the voter rolls and look over them at any point in time. And so in Michigan, we had a bunch of folks up there, and we said, look for two things. Look for people on the voting rolls who are more than 100 years old and they're still voting. Not that they can't, because there's people more than 100 who still vote, and good for them. But that's a small percentage. And then look for people on the voter rolls where there's more than 6 people at one address, and see what's going on there. Could be. Might have 10 at one address. Homeschool family, who knows? Whatever. So what we did in Virginia, and got called in Virginia, and one of them said, hey, there's 17 addresses, or there's 17 voters registered at this one address. What do you think? Must be a really big house. Why don't you go look at it? It was a cow pasture. There was not a single structure on it, but 17 voters were voting out of that cow pasture. So it takes eyeballs to see it. So when we're doing this in Michigan, and Chad Connolly with Faith Winds really does such a good job of setting this stuff up. But in Michigan, we got the list printed, 100-year-old names on each list, and so we start looking through it and going through it. And in the first 2 pages, we found 67 of those people who had online obituaries. They've been dead, and they're still voting. We've got the obituaries, and you got them on the list still voting. We found one guy who voted twice in 2020, which is not good. The guy was born in 1850, and he's still voting.
It's impressive.
He went through the Civil War, and he's still voting. And so when all this came out, the Secretary of State...
Can I guess for you who he voted for?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, you can't tell who they vote for on the voting stuff, so you can't tell if they vote R or D.
I bet I can figure it out.
The Secretary of State, when this stuff came out, actually filed a lawsuit to keep the dead people on the voter rolls. Mm-hmm. Why would you file a lawsuit to keep dead people on voter rolls? There's no reason to. Look, the first attempt at stealing an election was the first mail-in ballot was done in the Civil War in 1864. Democrats in 1864 said, hey, we got so many guys out in the field. McClellan's running against Lincoln, and Lincoln's unpopular. McClellan's popular. And so what happened was in 1864, they got a federal law passed to allow for mail-in ballots for military guys. And so they would go out to the battlefields, and you could vote in the battlefields, and they would return it and report it. And it led to the biggest fraudulent scandal ever happened. They found out that there were Democrats that set up complete factory lines where they had officers signing the officer's name, and they would sign the ballot, and it was all fake. And so it led to all sorts of convictions after that. But mail-in ballots have always, from the first time they were introduced, they've been a problem.
Did they actually put people in jail for doing that back then?
Yeah.
We've regressed.
Yeah, we don't hold people accountable.
We've regressed,
and that's a lot of elected officials that should be going to jail too.
Yeah. I think this week Georgia came out. Georgia revealed some of the election integrity issues in the state.
Yeah, there's a lot of states that have cleaned up things since the last election, but and that's good. But the trick is logarithms. If you're using electronic voting machines with logarithms, you can never beat the logarithm. And if you can't find the logarithm, and it took them nearly 3 years to find it from the last election, that's what you can never beat. You can do it with paper ballots. You can do it with normal voting machines. You can do it if your machine will not get hooked up to online stuff. And all these machines that were supposedly couldn't do it, we had guys.
If it's online, then in the middle of the night, they could tap into it, and which is what we see that spike in 2020.
Yeah.
In the middle of the night.
Yeah, everything went dead for 3 hours, and then came back up here, and you go, what was that? And as a math and science guy, I know what that is, and that's not good. Yeah. So it's this is the other thing I'll throw out there too. It really doesn't matter whether they cheat or not, because I think we're accountable for whether we vote or not. And there's no excuse ever for not voting.
No.
I learned from John Quincy Adams, a founding father who was the sixth president. He got involved in the anti-slavery stuff. And in the 17 years after his presidency, when he was in the House of Representatives fighting slavery, he lost every vote. I mean, he just didn't win. And people say, man, isn't that discouraging or frustrating? You never win. And he said, what do you do? And his answer was, he said, look, duty is ours, results are God's. He said, I don't answer for how it turns out. I answer for whether I did what I could do. And I think that's the thing for every citizen who votes. Duty is ours, results are, I don't know who's going to win the election, and it may be stolen. But you know what? I am going to vote because I'll answer to God for whether I tried to be a good steward of America. So for me, I will vote. Even if I knew the election was rigged, even if I knew it was stolen, I'd still vote because duty is ours, results are His.
And my last question was, what can American people do? And that kind of answers it right there. What can the American people do to ensure
I would
the future
say
of America?
The other thing is go back and study your history. Go back and find out who you are. Find out what happened. Find out the remarkable things that just who we are as a people. It's what we do at WallBuilders. Go see the museums. Come see the museums.
That's what I say, because I'm your friend. I have access. If I want to know something historically, I'll just call you and you'll answer it, and I'll get it. But not everybody has access to you. Like, how can people? How can people learn more about WallBuilders and go visit? Can anybody go visit WallBuilders?
Yeah.
Can anybody go visit Glenn's museum that I forget the name of it, but
yeah, online, because we have so many tours, it's good to go online and sign up because sometimes it's really full.
Yeah.
And very hard to see the stuff. So sign up online at wallbuilders.com or at americanjourneyexperience.org. That's the two museums.
And they're more likely going to get to meet you too, right?
We're around a whole lot.
Okay.
We're around a whole lot and see the stuff. Go to wallbuilders.com. We got all sorts of historical books that you can read and study. Lots of stuff.
That and you do so many things. Patriot Academy, the Congressional Pastors Conference that I was really privileged to get to speak at. What are some of those things to highlight some of the things you're doing that Americans get involved in?
Well, we spend our summer doing a lot of training. So young people 18 to 25 that are on their way to college, we know what they're going to get in college. We speak at colleges all over the United States. They go through a week of training. We can help equip them for what they're about to face, for what the history actually is. We take them through and let them see all the actual stuff. We know what they're going to train. So
to help prevent them from getting indoctrinated?
That's prevent them from, and literally we show them how to handle all the stuff that comes at them. We've literally had kids convert professors from being pro-socialist, pro-free market, or from pro-life to pro-abortion, pro-life. They just ask the right questions. All you got to do is make people think, and they will get there. So we teach kids how to ask questions, and that's one way.
Be critical thinkers. I gotta like make sure people understand and endorse that. Like if you're sending your kid to college, like how could you send your kid off to college for 4 years where more likely they're gonna be a doctor, especially if you're a Christian or a conservative, and not take advantage of something like that? That is amazing that you would do that 1 week to be prepared to go to college and potentially change their trajectory of their life. Like, I know so many kids that have from conservative families that went to college and they've lost their kids, lost relationships with their kids.
Yeah. From a faith perspective, as a Christian, the stats right now are if a kid has been raised in a Christian home with Christian values, and goes to a college, right now between 81 and 88% of those students will lose their faith. They will come out anti-Christian, very hostile. That's a bad stat. I mean, that's indoctrination. That is not education. That is indoctrination. Because when you can turn a whole group to anti what they were raised, that's indoctrination. Chad, this is a weird thing to say, but one of the most exciting pieces of history I have bought in recent years was just a few months ago, and it was John Quincy Adams. He's 18 years old, and he's engaged in a 2-hour debate. And in the 2-hour debate, it's at Harvard University. He gets 1 hour of debate. The other kid gets 1 hour debate. You know what the debate was over?
No.
Stick of asparagus. And the question was this. If you have a stalk of asparagus, it's green on one end, it's white on the other end. Did God intend you to eat the white end first or the green end first? They debated that for 2 hours. Now, why? Because it wasn't about this asparagus. It was about teaching them how to think. I'm going to hear one side of the argument. What will be my response? And so you take two trivial things.
Critical thinking.
It's critical thinking. And see, that's what we do in the summers is teach critical thinking. It's all about asking questions. And that's what Jesus asked 337 questions in the gospel. You direct things by asking questions. How do you ask questions? You have to know some things. So we do that for young people.
Did you get the asparagus? Is that what you have?
Oh, the asparagus.
What did you get? You said you got the artifact.
Oh, it was a letter. This fun part. It's a letter where the John Quincy Adams is trash talking the other guy he's going to debate.
Okay.
So the other guy's named William Cranch. He says, and essentially, I'm just popularized. He said, you better bring your A game because I am so going to trash you over this. Because he's got to defend the white side is what God will see. And he said, and I know you're going to convert to my side because you'll see the truth once I present it to you. But if you don't, I understand that people make dumb. And it's just trash talking for 4 pages.
Yeah.
But it's all about green versus white on asparagus, So it's all about thinking. So there's that. There's the teacher stuff with training teachers. If you deal with young people in school and you teach history, come see the real stuff. It'll change what you do. We do the pastors things, as you mentioned, twice a year. We take pastors to D.C., show them through the Capitol. We have access to do private tours in the Capitol, stuff that people don't see normally. And then we'll introduce you to a bunch of members of the House and Senate that you probably don't know about, good guys that are warriors for us. So we've got a lot of programs. You can go to wallbuilders.com under initiatives. There's a lot of things there that can be done. And the same thing with American Journey Experience.
And shout out to Tim Barton, your son, who's following your footsteps and carrying the torch forward. Yeah, he's incredible. He's a brilliant mind, just like you. And yeah, it's amazing to see the work he's doing. One last thing, you have written so many amazing books. What book would you point people to if they want to read any of your writings, get to know?
Right now, where America is, I would say The American Story.
Okay.
The American Story, because it really handles a lot of the criticism that's come out in the last 3 or 4 years about America.
Awesome. Well, it was a pleasure to have you here. And Miss Cheryl, always great to have you as well. And I look forward to getting out on the ranch with you.
Yeah,
some shooting. We'll break in that gun, go kill some hogs.
Thank you. Thanks, Smith & Wesson, the St. Vortex. Appreciate that. The glasses, all of it. Thank you, bro.
Absolutely, man. Love you, bro.
You too, man.
All right, guys. See you next week. Hey, guys. Thank you for watching this episode of The Resilient Show. I hope you enjoyed it. If you hadn't already, please click subscribe so you don't miss any future content. We have so many amazing guests scheduled, and you don't want to miss it.